Well, thank you, Paul. Can you all hear me at the back? If you can, wave your hands. Okay. The first thing you notice here is that I've given you one of the alternative spellings of Linacre. Now, anybody who's done any kind of historical research will know that it was quite common in days gone by, both for place names and especially surnames, to have different spellings in different documents. Well, let's get rid of the alternative spelling and we'll just use the one with which you're all familiar. And I say that with absolute confidence, just as I'm sure that you're also all familiar with this building. After all, it's only a couple of hundred yards from where we all are now, and it is, of course, the Thomas Linacre Centre, the main outpatient facility for Wigan hospitals, and it was, until 1972, the Wigan Grammar School for Boys. Now, I would predict that if we stop this presentation right now and all dissipated ourselves at random to various parts of the borough of Wigan and stopped the first local Wiganer that we saw and said to him or her, "Oh, I'm looking for the Thomas Linacre Centre, can you tell me where it is?" the overwhelming majority of them would be able to do that with ease. However, if you then said to them, "Thank you for that information, by the way, who was Thomas Linacre?" well, the overwhelming majority would either know nothing at all about him or at the most very little. So it's my job this evening to tell you quite a lot about him. And this is a portrait of him. I'll come back to that right at the end of my presentation. Now, I'm going to structure my talk today over these 9 headings. There will be an interval when I'm roughly over halfway through, just before we get to the sweating sickness, and until about 10 minutes, so that you can all go to the bar and get either an alcoholic drink or a non-alcoholic drink, or even a bag of crisps or a bag of nuts. Please support the bar, because our members know this, but guests may not know it. Real and Crafty let us have this room for nothing, so it helps if you can put something over the bar. If you look at the bottom one, which I've highlighted here, you immediately see the Wigan connection. He was the rector of Wigan in 1519, and he remained in that post for approximately 5 years, and in fact he died in that post. But let's go back to the start with the beginning. He was born in 1460. 1460, that's just over 500 years ago. Now, I want to tell you quite a lot about Linacre, but I also want to explain to you the ethos that was happening in England at this time. It was indeed a time of great change. We were moving out of what we call the Middle Ages. I mean, historians differ on when they say the Middle Ages started and ended, but it was the first time that people around this time were talking about the Middle Ages as if it was something in the past. And we were moving into the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, not only in England, but on the continent of Europe as well. And Linacre lived through all these changes. And on the throne at the time was Henry VI. Now, Henry VI, by all accounts, was a very poor king. There were quite a good reasons why he was a poor king. First of all, he'd come to the throne when he was only 9 months old. So for the first part of his reign, he didn't take any part of it. It was run by a variety of nobles. And towards the end of his reign, he became insane for 4 or 5 years and was locked up in the Tower. And then, amazingly, he recovered himself. He said he just felt like he'd been to sleep. And then he started to reign again. But of course, during that time again, the country was run by nobles. And they were either falling out amongst themselves or feathering their own nests. Now, I'm a huge fan of Winston Churchill. I've read quite a lot of what he's written. He has an amazing command of the English language. And in his book, 4 volumes book, The History of the English-Speaking People, this is what Churchill says about Henry VI. He says, as Henry VI grew up, his virtues and his simplicity became equally apparent. His virtues, first of all. Before he was 18 years of age, he'd absorbed himself in the foundation of the colleges of Eton and Cambridge. And then the bad part of him. He says, Churchill says, he showed a feebleness of mind and spirit and a gentleness in nature which were little suited to the fierce rivalries of a martial age. Now, his father, of course, had been Henry V, who had conquered all of what we now call northern France. You know, the Battle of Agincourt, many of you would have heard of that. Churchill goes on. These were evil days for England. The crown was beggarly, the nobles rich, the people were unhappy and unrestful rather than being unprosperous. The empires, so swiftly gained on the continent, were being cast away by an incompetent and self-enriching oligarchy. And the revenues which might have sent irresistible armies to beat the French were engrossed by the church. So that was Linacre in his birth, at the time of his birth. Now, although he was born in 1960, historians are all agreed about that. We do not know his exact date of birth. And those same historians who agree on the date of birth disagree about where he was born. Some of them say he was in Canterbury, and some of them say he was in Brampton in Derbyshire. There is no doubt that his family came from Derbyshire. They were a very famous family. They're mentioned in the Domesday Book, and their address is given as Linacre House. Well, even if he wasn't born in Canterbury, there's no doubt that's when he went to school. He attended the Cathedral School in Canterbury, and there he came under the influence of the headmaster, William Selling. And Selling was an Augustine monk. Now, I'll draw your attention here to the alternative spelling. Selling's name, according to his birth certificate, was William Tilly, or Tiley, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. And he lived in the village of Selling, with an S for sugar, which is a small village southeast of Faversham and west of Canterbury in Kent. But he seems universally known as William Selling with a C. It's strange tradition, that, isn't it? But I'm thinking of revising it. Instead of calling myself Eric Curless, I'll call myself Eric Hireince. There is some suggestion that Linacre's family and Selling's family were distantly related. Even if that's not true, it's certainly true that Selling, who was the headmaster of the school, gave Linacre personal tuition and particularly gave him the love of Latin and Greek, which served him well all his life. And they kept in touch even long after Linacre had left school. And you'll hear more about Selling later. So we come to number 2 in my list of 9, when he went up to Oxford. Now, he arrived in Oxford in 1480. Now, remember, I told you he was born in 1460, so that makes him 20 years old. That was quite old for the time. We are now used to our students going to university when they're 17 or 18. But in these days, students went to Oxford and Cambridge when they were 16 or even 15. And I've struggled to find out what Linacre was doing during this time. There doesn't seem to be anything about him, but that's one of those things. He made up for his lost time. He was an outstanding scholar in Latin and Greek and classics, and he qualified with first-class honours. And he also made up in time because he was elected a fellow of the college only 4 years later. And in those days, it usually took 7 years before you were elected a fellow of the college. So Linacre was also showing his brilliance at this stage. It was All Souls College in Oxford. It was a relatively new college. By the way, Selling was also a member of it. And you may sometimes see All Souls College competing on University Challenge. The present graduates of that college say that it's the hardest examination that anybody can sit, but I would dispute that. So I'm going to move on now to number 3, the Italian connections, and I want to spend quite a bit of time on this, not only because Linacre spent a long time in Italy and met many famous people there, many of whom became his friends, but because it was so important. There was such a lot of change happening at the time, and I want to give you a flavour of both the military, the political, the royal, and the religious ethos that prevailed during this time that Linacre spent in Italy. He went to Italy following Selling. And Selling had gone to Italy, having been sent by the king as a papal envoy to Rome, to the papal court. Now, why was this? Why was the king sending Selling to Italy, to Rome? You need to know who the king was at this time, and I've highlighted king here. And at this time in England, there were only 2 ways you could become king. One was by proper, legitimate descent through the male line. It's no good if you're an illegitimate, and there was no shortage of illegitimate children of all the kings in England and in Europe at the time, and it was no good if it came through the female line. However, he did have some royal blood. His mother was Margaret Beaufort. She was the great-granddaughter of one of the sons of Edward III, right? And his mother and father were John of Gaunt and his mistress, Catherine Swyford. Now, so he'd come through the female line and probably illegitimate at that. There are some historians who say they were secretly married, right? But it's not clear about that. Anyway, Henry was Henry Tudor, who'd won the battle. He defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth, and that date is a very important date. Everybody in England knows about 1066 and all that, but this is probably an equally important date because it was the end of the Plantagenet reign, which has ruled England for 350 years, and the start of the Tudor reign. And Henry Tudor, he arrived in Milford Haven, and it took him about 14 days, as you see there, to travel up to Boswell Fields. And on his way, he was gathering other nobles to come on his side. All this had been planned by Henry when he was exiled in France. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that later. And then he defeated Richard against all odds. There was a little bit of skullduggery. There's some evidence that some of the nobles held back and only joined the battle when they saw that Henry Tudor was starting to win. You know, they changed sides a bit. That's not quite clear. Anyway, it only took him 2 hours to do that defeat, and then he made his way back down to London in a couple of days. His mates, by the way, the aides of Henry VII, who'd come across with him from France, they were already in London this was a pre-arranged plan, plotting his marriage. Right? They decided all this when they were in France, and they brought his bride to be out of the Tower where she'd been incarcerated there, and she, of course, was Elizabeth of York. She was a Yorkist. I'm going to say a lot more about the War of the Roses in a few minutes. Whereas Henry Tudor was a Lancastrian. Right? Now, they didn't wait any time. They got back to London. He was crowned quite quickly. You know, Prince Charles is planning his crowning, isn't he, for over several months. There's going to be a bank holiday. Richard didn't do anything like that. He was married quite quickly and crowned quite quickly. And of course, they had a son quite quickly. He was born in 1486. And you remember, Bosworth was only in 1485. So it was just under a year that the firstborn was born, and he was a boy. Marvellous. You know, the reign being secured. He was Prince Arthur, the Prince of Wales. And then there was a second child, living child, Margaret. She was to marry James IV of Scotland. Now, that was a good move, because always there'd been this fighting and antagonism between England and Scotland. So Henry Tudor had quieted that down for a while. And then there was another son called Henry, and you all know him because he became Henry VIII. I don't need to tell you any more about him. Everybody knows about Henry VIII. And finally, there's a fourth living child called Mary. And Mary, it was after her father's death, but she was to marry Philip II of Spain. And that was a good move on behalf of the King Tudor as well, because there'd always been antagonism, not only with Scotland, but also with Spain and France. So he was creating a good deal of peace at the time. I've said there were living children. There were actually 7 children in all. And sadly, Elizabeth York, the wife of Henry Tudor, she died a couple of days after the birth of her 7th child, who also died, of course. Not an uncommon thing in those days. Aren't we so lucky today that that sort of thing very rarely happens? Now, Henry VII, Henry Tudor, he was an extremely good organiser, and he was pretty good at getting rid of all those who he didn't agree with, right? If necessary, he executed them. He didn't mess about. He also built a sound economy. The economy was in a mess. Richard III, he'd left the economy in a mess, you know, a little bit like ours at the moment. And he effectively ended the War of the Roses. Now, I just want to say something about the War of the Roses, again from Churchill's book. He writes whole chapters on all of these things. And it's very much ill understood. And Churchill goes on like this. He says, the mortal struggle between York and Lancaster did not imply any antagonism between the two English well-known counties. A lot of people think that, but it wasn't that at all. York was in fact the stronghold of the Lancastrians. In fact, these are my words, the Duke of York was a prominent Lancastrian. So Churchill says York was the stronghold of the Lancastrians, and the Yorkists found their strength upon the Midlands and the south of England. He goes on to say, the ups and downs of fortune were so numerous and startling, and the family feuds so complicated, and the interests of the national feeling in moments of crisis were difficult to measure. Now, there's a lot about the fighting between the War of the Roses went on for 30 years, and sometimes the nobles fell out amongst themselves, and sometimes the Yorkists were on top, and sometimes the Lancastrians were on top. And at one stage, the Yorkists were very much on top. And Churchill went on with this. He says, with the fall of Alnwick, only one fortress in the whole of the kingdom still resisted. The castle of Harlech on the western sea alone flaunted the red rose. Harlech stood the siege for 7 years. When it surrendered in 1468, there were but 50 effective fighting men in the garrison. Amongst them was a child of 12 who had survived the rigours of the long blockade. He was a nephew of Jasper, the grandson of Owen Tudor, and the future founder of the Tudor dynasty and system of government. His name, of course, was the Duke of Richmond, later to become King Henry VII. So this was Henry VII, and he was a great friend, of course, as you know, of Thomas Linacre. Now, he wasted no time, having secured his reign, having got the economy right, having got rid of all the people who he didn't get on with, but he was pretty good at appointing Yorkists, remember Henry Tudor was Lancastrian, if they were good at the job and they agreed to toe the line. That's how he effectively ended the War of the Roses. And then, what did Henry do? He betrothed Prince Arthur to Catherine of Aragon when they were both 3 years old. Catherine of Aragon, of course, she was the daughter of the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. And he sends Linacre and Selling to Rome to keep on the right side of the Pope. Now, why should he do that? Well, England and Europe were entirely Catholic at the time. Rome was very powerful, the church was very powerful, the Pope was very powerful, and they were also very corrupt. You know, whenever you get a powerful regime or a powerful group or anything, it's not long before corruption follows. The plan was for Selling to go as an envoy to the papal court, and almost certainly for Linacre to be a junior envoy too. So he'd been picked up by Henry VII, probably with Selling's advice. However, Linacre did something that he seems to have done a lot. Suddenly, without any explanation, he decides that he'll not carry on with Selling to Rome, he'll stay in Bologna. One of the problems with Thomas Linacre is he didn't write much about his own thoughts and what he was doing. He was a very quiet man. He sort of kept himself to himself. Most of what we know about him is what other people wrote about him. He was great at translating, and he was a very great scholar, but didn't write much about his own inner thoughts. He became a pupil of Angelo Poliziani, a very famous university in Italy. And he contributed to a lot of translations with these people from ancient Greek. The ancient Greek texts had just been found and they weren't available in Latin, and he had to translate them. So that was a great contribution, and he continued that all his life. Now here there were two interesting things. In the party were two sons of Lorenzo de' Medici. Now, I think I told you that at this time, the Pope had been elected, quite surprisingly, by... there were two other famous cardinals who everybody thought would become Pope. This was Pope Innocent VIII, by the way. And it was said that he was elected because Lorenzo had persuaded the cardinals to vote for him. You remember the Medici, they were a corrupt family, the sort of forerunners of the present mafia. Also, Two of the sons of Lorenzo were in Linacre's class, and the younger son, Giovanni, was later to become Pope Leo X. Not only that, they remained friends, and the Pope and Linacre, when the Pope was in Rome and Linacre was back in England, they corresponded with each other. So this is how good Thomas Linacre was. He was still a young man. He'd been picked out by the King of England, and he was now a friend of the future Pope. So not a bad start, I suppose. And he translated lots of work from Greek to Latin, and then he did something else again. For unknown reasons, he suddenly decided, instead of coming back to England where he could have taught in Oxford, he decided to take himself off to Padua, to the medical school there. He'd never shown any signs or written anything why he should do that, and we don't know why he did it, but he did it. And it was certainly a good move, because the medical school was far better than anything in England. There was just a rather poor medical college both in Oxford and Cambridge. And there, while he was in the medical school, he translated the works of Galen. Now, I have to tell you that Galen was the father of Greek medicine. He was born in 125 AD, the 2nd century just after Christ, and he translated the works of Galen from Greek into Latin. Now, in those days, the doctors could read Latin, but very few of them could read Greek. So this was a good thing for him to do. And also, the translations had become corrupt over the years, and people were starting to complain about this, just as Martin Luther, was complaining about the corruption from interpretation of the Bible that you could only get from the priests. And Galen had a very strange view as to what disease was all about. He thought there were 4 humours, and these humours, I need to go back just there, were black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. What a crazy idea, but the doctors were obsessed with this idea, and they would take you and engage into it and say, this is what balance, and then prescribe various treatments. Of course, you're not surprised that Linacre graduated with honours in 1486, and he's now a famous scholar and a famous doctor. So again, you think he'd come back to England either to practice medicine or to go back to Oxford. But no, he takes himself off on a continental tour. I'll just go back again. He goes from Padua to Vicenna, to Verona, to Bergamo, and to Milan. And he takes a couple of years doing all this. So this was the start of what became a sort of continental tour. And soon after that, graduates from Oxford and Cambridge started, especially the wealthy ones, when they qualified, to go out and do this sort of continental circuit. Just as our young graduates now take a year out, don't they? It's either going hiking or camping or working abroad or something. Nothing like that. I qualified on the Thursday and started work on the Saturday. And I would have started earlier, except I needed a certificate to prove that I qualified. So we now come to nearly halfway through now. He's now a famous scholar and a famous doctor with royal connections. Now, what about these royal connections? He returned to England probably in 1499. Always different dates. It's quite difficult to know just exactly what was happening, but I come to the conclusion it was in 1499 with the intention of practicing and teaching medicine in Oxford. And there he joined a circle of Oxford scholars. Now, it was Decidius Erasmus, the famous humanist from Rotterdam, who gave this title. I just want to say something, just show you how he met with such important people. Here are the 4 of them. Now, the first one, John Colet, He became Dean of St. Paul's. He died quite young at the age of 52. The next one, William Groken, he was a Greek teacher in Oxford. They were all good humanists. He lived quite a good time in those days. He died at the age of 73. Thomas Linacre was the, what do you call it when somebody looks after the will? What's the word? An executor. He was the executor to his will. And he got paid for that. But Linacre was a very generous man. Instead of just taking the money, he gave the money to set up schools and scholarships for poor students. So that's a good thing about him. William Latimer, he was an ancient Greek scholar and a priest, and he was the man who eventually was to advise Henry VIII about the legality of his marriage and his possible divorce from Catherine of Aragon. So Thomas Linacre was with these things. And the last three, Groken, Latimer, and Linacre, there's very good documentary evidence that they decided to get together and translate the works of Aristotle from ancient Greece. Unfortunately, we can't find those works, so either it was never done or it was lost. I think it was probably never done because other things overtook all of them. And one of the things that took all of them was that the King Henry VIII, got other ideas, and he appointed Linacre as tutor to Prince Arthur. Prince Arthur, remember, the Prince of Wales, destined to be the next king. So Linacre has to go now to the royal family, into Rome. So let's just look at Prince Arthur for a minute. He's born in 1486. He's betrothed to Catherine when they're both 3 years old. I've told you that already. And they're both married when they're 15. What actually happens was Catherine of Aragon, she left Spain on the 25th of September 1501, and she married Arthur. It took about 6 weeks to get here, and once she got here, she was married within a couple of days. So it looks like Henry now has secured his role. He's got his eldest boy who's safely married, and unfortunately, Arthur dies 5 months later. And what did he die of? We're not sure, but he probably died of sweating sickness. I'm going to tell you all about that after the interval. Arthur, when he died, was in Ludlow in Wales. He was the capital with Aragon, with Catherine of Aragon, and I would suspect that Linacre and some of the other senior people who were in London, they were probably relieved at that because they didn't have to explain what was happening. So Henry VII is appointed Linacre as tutor, but then once the Prince of Wales has died, Linacre is then freed for a while, and he's now able to practice his own medicine. And he's very good at it because he has some very famous patients. Erasmus, who I've told you about, Thomas More, author of Utopia, and Cardinal Wolsey, who became the chief advisor to him, were all patients of Thomas Linacre. And several of them, particularly Erasmus, commented what a good physician he was, how kind he was, and how good he was, and how he often got the prognosis right. We move on to the next thing, which was the sweating sickness. Now, I'll just go back and remember when I told you about the famous Oxford scholars, the 4 Oxford scholars, and why their translation was not made. Well, one of the things that was quite interesting is they suddenly, just after this time, which I'm going to come to now, they moved from Oxford to Cambridge, and there's no clear reason why they did that. But I have my own view. I think that they moved because the sweating sickness was in Oxford, and they decided to go to Cambridge in order to avoid it. People realised whatever the sweating sickness was, the most important thing was to try to get away from it. Now, I've no real proof of that, but that's just my idea. Anyway, the sweating sickness. Sometimes called, well, commonly called the English sweats. And there I put the Latin name for English sweat, pseudo anglicus, called the English sweat because only the English had it. This disease did not appear mysteriously anywhere else except in England. There were 5 distinct epidemics over a period of 75 years. And it started in 1485. Now you remember 1485 was the day of the Battle of Bosworth, the date of the Battle of Bosworth, and some people said that it had first been brought to England in 1485 by Henry Tudor's army. If you look on the internet, there's a lot of people saying that. I don't buy that idea at all. There is no evidence whatsoever that any of Henry Tudor's men were suffering from the sweating sickness. None at all. And I'll give you a little piece of information in a little while. I'll not tell you anything about the second epidemic because it was rather small, not very important. But the third epidemic, which of course was 37 years after the first, right? And in the interval of time, nobody had it, right? It was very severe. It was mainly in England, just a few foreign visitors. And then we come to the fourth epidemic. That was similar. It did this time spread from London north, but didn't go to Scotland. Now, you know, Scotland were very good at keeping unpleasant things out. They didn't. The Romans never got into Scotland. Yeah, the English never got into Scotland, and I think they kept the sweating sickness out as well, right? But both Cromwell and Boleyn and Worsley, the Cardinal, they all had their sweating sickness. Some of them several times, but they all recovered. And the final episode, and now we're 125 years later, was in Shrewsbury in April, and it had gone. It was very short-lived, but it was very, very severe, and there were 1,000 deaths in that episode. And you know, the population of England wasn't very great in that time, so a much greater effect than we've had with COVID. Now, what was it caused by? Well, we think one of the things you've got to remember is the doctors in those days, they had no idea of the nature of disease. They didn't understand infections. They didn't know about bacteria. They didn't know about viruses. So they had very funny ideas about what things were. They would say it was sort of from vapours arising from foul water and all that sort of nonsense. I'm not blaming them for that. How could they know about it? They haven't got the knowledge. But what the doctors were very good at were writing descriptions of disease. So when we now read the descriptions with our knowledge, we can think, oh, maybe this is what it was. Now, some people have said that it was a virus. We think it was a virus similar to influenza. And some people have said that it was a lantavirus. I don't want to confuse you with too many medical facts, but lantavirus is a very, very rare form of influenza, and it's possibly carried by rats. And it's different from ordinary influenza because you get pneumonia very quickly and die very quickly, right? People who die of complications of pneumonia with ordinary flu, it takes a long time. You have the flu first of all, then there's a complication, a late complication, you develop pneumonia, right? And they say it was carried by rats. Well, when you look at who died with sweating sickness, it was a bit like who died with COVID. Hardly any children died. I think I'm right in saying that not a single child under the age of 12 who didn't have some other complicated condition died of COVID. Hardly any young people died of COVID. Just old people died of COVID and people with other comorbidities. You know, people who were grossly overweight and people who were diabetics. They were all the COVID deaths. So if you said it was carried, but now this wasn't like that. It was the other way around. Young people, not babies, but young people died of sweating sickness rather than the old people. So you would have to say the rats were only biting a certain part of the population, which is big numbers. So I don't buy that idea at all. Also, there were high fatalities and rapid death. You've got to remember, if Prince Arthur in Ludlow had died of sweating sickness, he fitted the bill quite thin. He became ill in the morning and he was dead later that night. In fact, the saying was, well at breakfast, dead by lunch. Right? That was commonly said. If you didn't die in the first day or the first 2 days, you tended to recover. Yeah? Not only did Prince Arthur get the sweating sickness, get this illness, his wife, Catherine of Aragon, who was also there in the castle, she was also ill, but she recovered within a couple of days. The other thing that's different about it is its time relationship. We know that most respiratory infections are very common in winter and early spring, and not at all in summer and autumn. But this was different. This was in late summer and early autumn. So we don't understand why that was. And the infection, the epidemics spiked quickly and receded quickly. And then when they'd gone, for several years, there was none at all. Now, it's not like influenza. We are all aware that common cold and influenza occur every single year, sometimes hardly at all, sometimes very severe, causing problems, but never does it not occur at all. But this, sometimes it would recede quickly and go away. So in the end, I would say that there's a lot of unanswered questions. I've really tried to research this as much as I can. There's a lot of nonsense written it on the internet that doesn't add up. And I think we can say there are unanswered questions. But the great thing is we haven't seen it since October 1551. So let's hope it keeps away from then. It just lasted for 75 years, the first 3/5 of the Tudor regime. Right? So this was a time when Thomas Linacre would know all about it as a doctor. Now, moving on now. Now, Thomas Linacre was the founder president of the Royal College of Physicians. And in my opinion, this was without any shadow of doubt his greatest achievement. And this is one thing that we know why Linacre took part in this. I did tell you earlier on, he didn't write much about his own thoughts, but he did write about why he was doing this. And this is what he said. He was worried about what he called the indiscriminate practice of medicine. Now, in those days, being a doctor, priest suddenly became a doctor, or a doctor became a priest, and so forth. And he persuaded Henry VIII, and this is his words, I put in inverted commas there, to enact an institution of a body of regular physicians empowered to decide who should practice medicine in Greater London. So it was the first time he was trying to control epidemics. Now, who did this besides Henry VIII? First of all, the doctors at this time were of very poor quality. Never mind that they didn't understand science, they were pretty poor in England. There were only 2 medical schools, not very good, one in Oxford and one in Cambridge. Nothing at all like was in northern Italy, in Padua, and other parts of northern Italy. You've got to remember, Linacre himself was a graduate of Padua. He and 5 other physicians, 6 of them in all of them Padua graduates, they tried to persuade Henry VIII to form the college. And the word here is empowered. you're going to control doctors for the first time. Now, a few historians have very unkindly said that this was a move on the doctors to create a closed shop, right? I can assure you, it was nothing like that at all. The doctors were very poorly recognised in those days. You could become a priest and then a doctor or a quack and so forth. And the other thing is, I'll just go back there, I want to say something else. It wasn't just Henry VIII who took part in it, but Thomas Wolsey, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Archbishop of York, and the Lord Chancellor, holder of the Great Seal. He was at the height of his powers in 1515. And he was very worried about all the epidemics that were going on at the time. Henry VIII himself was very worried about his own health. He said that he carried around with him all the time religious relics that would ward off disease. I don't think it worked, by the way. Yeah. He also had, just listen to this, 53 houses. Now, I think our royal family and Prime Minister and so forth have several residences, but they don't have 53 houses. And Henry VIII was pretty good at moving around the country whenever there were epidemics, from one house to the other, trying to avoid it. So he'd be very keen to do this. And what epidemics were occurring at the time? I've got some notes here, just give me a moment. Yes. The plague, there were two episodes of plague, one in 1509 to 1510, and the second one in 1516 to 1517, all the time that this was going on, right? There were the sweats. If you remember, a few minutes ago, I told you the third serious epidemic of the sweats was in 1517, just at this time, right? There was malaria, there was tuberculosis, there was TB, and there was no effective treatment for any of these things. In fact, no proper understanding of the nature of those diseases. And the only thing was to try to get away from it. If you had any sense at all, you tried to get away from it, as Henry did. Wolsey himself had 3 episodes of the sweats, but recovered. With the sweats, I don't know if any of you saw the film Wolf Hall. I haven't seen the film, but I've read the book. And there I understand from the film that Mark Rylance played Cromwell. Am I right? Yes, someone nodded. And the film opens with Cromwell lamenting the death of his wife and 2 of his daughters within 24 hours from the sweats, right? That's how quickly it killed them. So they were clearly afraid of these epidemics. So Wolsey was very powerful, persuaded Henry VIII to set up the Royal Commission, and it got a Royal Charter. And it's the forerunner of the present Royal College of Physicians. Now, the Royal College of Physicians, first of all, when Henry gave the money and the charter, it only applied to 6 miles around the centre of London. But within a very short time, it was extended to the whole of London, and within a few years, the next Parliament passed an act that made the college responsible for the whole of England. And this was the forerunner of the Royal College. This was a brilliant thing that Linacre did. And all his life, even right up to his death, he constantly was translating works of Galen and trying to get the doctors better standards in England. So I think the idea that it was just creating a closed shop is nonsense. It was really to try to create better standards. And at present, the Royal Colleges, they look after hospital consultants. So if you're a consultant physician, you're a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians. If you're a consultant anaesthetist, you're a fellow of the Royal College of Anaesthetists. And of course, you all know about the General Medical Council, the GMC, that controls the whole of doctors. You cannot practice medicine in England unless you're registered with the GMC. And they look after the standards in general. So, I'm getting down near to the end, when he suddenly decides to become ordained as a priest. Now, there's no hint at all as to why he should suddenly take up holy orders, why he should suddenly be ordained as a priest. But here's one of the things that I've just read, only within the last 48 hours, actually. And some senior person of the College of Physicians said it was because he did this to accrue ecclesiastical preferments with steady incomes rather than an interest in religion, right? So money was involved. I don't blame him for that. Doctors were very poorly paid in those days, not at all. The details of his holy orders are unclear. I found the dates for writing this particular thing quite difficult, but nothing like this section. The dates just don't add up. If you read the Catholic history thing about how Linacre became a priest, it's all nonsense. The church rules at the time were very slack, discipline was poor, and in fact, Luther and others at the time were starting to complain about this corruption in the church. Of course, so it was probably, when he took holy orders, probably about 1509 to 1510. It's just possible, of course. No record at all as to when he was just made a deacon, never mind ordained as a priest. But it's possible, you've got to remember, that his mate was the Pope, right? You know, and it's possible that the Pope just said, okay, I'll do that, and he could do that. It was terribly corrupt, particularly Pope Leo X. It is said about Pope Leo X, and whether this is true I don't know, but I'll read it to you. He's supposed to have said, the fable of Christ has been very profitable for us. Right? The fable of Christ has been very profitable. He was certainly the one who was keen on indulgences and so forth, all the thing that Luther was against. Well, here's how he becomes a Roman Catholic priest. He first of all becomes rector of Marsham in Kent. Now, we do know the date of this exactly because it's recorded. It was on the 23rd of October, 1509, right? He stayed in that post for less than 1 month, and it's interesting that it was unpaid, right? He then becomes the prebend of Wells. Now, I'll tell you what a prebend is very shortly. When I started to write this, I had no idea what a prebend was. I had to look up the word in the English Oxford Dictionary. He then becomes the incumbent at Hawkesford. Now, here's an interesting thing. I told you that he became the rector of Wigan in 1519, and he was rector of Wigan until he died in 1524. He was still the incumbent of Hawkesford. He got the job in 1510, and when he died, he was still the incumbent at Oxford. So I presume that was fairly well paid. So he had several appointments all at the same time. And then he becomes canon and prebend in Westminster. Now, this is what this prebend is. This is what the Oxford Dictionary tells me it is. It is the stipend or maintenance granted to a canon of a cathedral or collegiate church out of its revenue. So there's money involved here, right? And I'll let you read the next three for yourselves. Now, if you go on Google and you look up the rectors of Wigan, what you find very interesting is that the rector of Wigan, before Thomas Linacre, was the chap who went on to be the prebend of York. There's a chap called Richard Wyatt. And he then was rector of Wigan, then he went to prebend of York, so they seem to have done a swap. Right? A bit like shuffling the cabinet about, you know, your Minister of Health one day and Minister of Education the next day, you all swap around. Anyway, he was the rector of Wigan, as I say, from October in 1519 until he died almost exactly 5 years later. And Wigan Rectory, by the way, was very wealthy. There was all this land about you know, all around where we are now, and you were also lord of the manor. So we should be very proud that Henry Linacre, and that Thomas Linacre wanted to come to Wigan. He died there in October 20. Now, I've told you all a lot. I've gone through all these things here today. So it's now time for, are there any questions? Now, I'm very deaf, so it's no good shouting it out. You have to put your hand up, and then I can recognise you. And right.
Was the suggestion that he actually held the post, that he spent time in Wigan? Did he actually spend the time in Wigan, or was it just a post that he held to take the income?
The question is, did he spend a lot of time in Wigan? Well, I'm going to ask you all a question that, so I just won't hear it. I just won't answer that yet at all. It's coming. Paul.
When did Henry VIII become king? What was his connections if he was king when Thomas Linacre was still alive? And probably nothing to do with it.
When Thomas Linacre was alive?
Was Henry VIII king?
Henry VIII king? Yes. Oh yes. Oh, he became physician to Henry VIII. But Linacre died while Henry VIII was still king.
Okay, so the question is, was he still a Catholic priest when Henry VIII what's the word? Got rid of the
Right, I have a few more slides on that as well, which will explain that. I'm anticipating.
So you just said then he actually died in Wigan. Is there evidence of that?
He died in Wigan. No, I didn't say he died in Wigan.
You did.
Oh, did I? He died when he was rector of Wigan.
Ah, right. Okay.
Right. And he died of a stone in the bladder.
Right. Where's he buried?
Right, he's buried in St Paul's Cathedral. He's the only rector of Wigan to be buried in St Paul's Cathedral. Unfortunately, you can't visit the tomb. I tried to do that, because it was destroyed in the Fire of London in 1466. You know, the Fire of London was just about 6 days in 1466, and it burned north central London, including the building of the Royal College of Physicians, which Linacre had given. Linacre gave his house, part of his house, and his library to the Royal College when he became first president.
1666.
But it was destroyed.
You mean 1666?
Sorry?
You mean 1666? He didn't die until 15 something.
Linacre died in 1424.
1524.
Oh, 1524. 1524. Sorry, 1524. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to ask you a question now about Thomas Linacre, and the question is, where did he live when he was rector of Wigan? Where did he live in Wigan? I don't want the address, I just want the rough idea where he lived.
Somebody told me he actually never visited Wigan, but whether that's true or not, I don't know.
10 out of 10. there's no evidence that he ever came to Wigan. Right? But don't find that surprising. Cardinal Wolsey, who first of all was Archbishop of York, had never been to York. Right? He was on his way to York when he fell out, when Henry VIII fell out with him and they were trying to get him in this sad journey. And he was on his way to York when he was arrested, about to be taken back to the Tower, but he fell ill with some internal bowel condition and he died within 48 hours. So he died, luckily, before he was executed in the Tower, and he never ever went to York. So it was not at all unusual. Okay, well, where did he live? Why is this buzzing about? Have I done something?
No, no, it's all right.
Okay. Well, when Prince Arthur died, right, Henry VII appointed Linacre as preceptor, that's a fancy name for teacher, to Princess Mary, the second child. And there's certain documentary evidence at the time that they lived that time in Stonehouse, in Knight Rider Street, parish of St John's in London. And he seemed to have lived there all the time, right? When he became president of the Royal College of Physicians, the house, part of the house that he donated and the library was in Knight Rider Street. So the answer is, when he was rector of Wigan, he lived in London. Right, there's no evidence he came there. However, we should be very proud of this great man. Now, here, I suspect that within the next few weeks, few months, quite a lot of you in this room, someone will say to you, oh, I've got an appointment at the Thomas Linacre Centre, right? Or I've just been to Thomas Linacre. Well, that gives you an opening, don't you? You'll be able to say, oh, do you know who Thomas Linacre was? And you'll tell him all these marvellous things, right? Now, I've told you that he's a quiet man. He's never married. He had no enemies. But I'm going to tell you something extra about Thomas Linacre that I've only learned quite recently, right? When I got a copy of his will. He was very generous. He left a lot of his books and stuff to the college and to the library. He instituted a library in Oxford, which, by the way, has been possibly changed the name of a Vietnamese billionaire. I don't know if you've seen that. I see people nodding. I hope that doesn't happen. But he leaves something in his will, right, to his brother, who is called Thomas Linacre, right? So Thomas Linacre not only had several spellings, but he had a brother called Thomas Linacre, and I think that's absolutely amazing. And I would like to think, as Michael Caine would say, not a lot of people know that. Now, one other thing, before I finish, here is the portrait that I showed you in the beginning. If you go on the website, various people claim that this is a portrait by Hans Holbein, the famous artist. If you look at the website of Wigan Thomas Linacre Centre, this picture comes up with stuff. But I can assure you that this painting is not by Hans Holbein. This is a portrait. I've got this knowledge right from the top of the Royal College of Physicians. This is a portrait, oiled on canvas, that is held in the Royal College of Physicians. I've seen it many times. And it's a copy made in 1810, quite late, by Bedell Williams Miller, and it's a 17th century portrait of a portrait that hangs in Windsor Castle, unnamed, and now thought to be nothing at all to do with Thomas Linacre. But it's a nice picture, isn't it? So why don't we say it is? Now, Paul, I think you asked me about whether he was king and so forth. Right. Here's the timeline of various people around. Now, I've highlighted Martin Luther there. There's no evidence at all that Linacre and Luther ever met. Martin Luther nailed his 95 theses on the church door at Wittenberg in 1517. So that was just before Linacre was appointed here, 2 years before he was appointed rector of Wigan, right? Pope Leo X, who was Linacre's friend, excommunicated Luther in 1521, right? While Linacre was still rector of Wigan, so he would certainly be aware of all that. However, he did die in 1524, and the Act of Supremacy was only in 1534, 10 years after Linacre's death. The Act of Supremacy that made Henry broke from Rome and in charge of the Church of England, and the Pope at the time was Clement VII, who then excommunicated Henry VIII. So it would be interesting if Linacre had lived, how would he have coped with that? Right? Whose side would have been on? Remember, he was a friend of the Pope and a friend of Henry VIII. You've also got to remember that Henry VIII was a very good Catholic for a large part of his reign. He was very religious. In fact, early on, he actually wrote a tract against Luther when Luther first nailed these things, and the Pope made him defender of the faith, which the present royal family still have. So it's interesting to think about it. What it is. My own view is, I think Linacre would probably have stuck with the Catholic Church, just like Erasmus did. Erasmus decided to stay with the Catholic Church and try to reform it from within. But we'll never know that. Okay, folks, that's it.
Thank you.
Well, it's difficult to know what to say. What a fantastic talk we had. It brought to mind for me a programme, or several programmes I've watched of Simon Sebag Montefiore. The depth that you've gone into it, you just didn't have the BBC footage of all the stuff. Other than that, it's just amazing, Eric.
Okay.
Well done. Thank you very much.
Okay. One final slide. These are the gates at the corner of Thomas Linacre Centre, Wigan Grammar School. I first walked through those gates as an 11-year-old boy in 1946. And I walked through them every day, every school day, for the next 4 years. In those days, they were always open. There were no cars in the car park, in the quadrangle. And they weren't rusting and locked up and full of weeds like they are now, right? Which pains me when I see them. So if there's anybody in this room who has any influence on this regard at all, will you please ask the relative people to clean them all up? Thank you very much.